just read you a prepared statement to begin, and then I'll open an offer for questions. I do intend to stay in the lane for this particular issue that I'm about to brief you on, and we have other opportunities at a later date for more fulsome operations briefing, and I'd like to hold any other detailed questions you may be inclined to ask to an event such as that. But thank you very much, as I've said, for coming here at the short notice that we've provided. And today I'd like to inform you of Australia's possible involvement in a civilian casualty event that occurred in Iraq in 2017. Tomorrow, the Coalition will issue its monthly statement updating the status of its investigations into civilian casualty allegations. Today's media briefing, therefore, is embargoed until that statement is issued. You'll be advised by Defence when the embargo is lifted, and that will be through the issuing of our own statement, which will summarise the information that I will provide you today. We have endeavoured to provide a full account of incidents potentially involving Australian aircraft ahead of the monthly Coalition statement in the past, and so today we continue that practice. So now on to the particulars of this incident. I can confirm that an Australian airstrike or nearby Coalition airstrikes in the Al-Shafar neighbourhood of West Mosul on the 13th of June 2017 may have caused civilian casualties. An Australian investigation found that it is not possible to determine the number of civilian casualties that occurred as the result of these airstrikes. The Air Wars website report on this incident cites local media reporting and social media posts with a wide variation in the assessment of numbers killed. The Coalition assesses that between 6 and 18 civilians may have been killed, and that's based on assessment of population densities. Due to a 7-month delay between the incident and Australia becoming aware of the claims, we could not verify the numbers killed. Moreover, it's not possible to determine if the civilian casualties occurred as a result of the Australian airstrike, the nearby Coalition airstrikes, or indeed from other actors. This incident occurred at the height of the battle for Mosul, when Iraq security forces were engaged in intense urban warfare. Iraqi positions and fleeing civilians were being routinely attacked by Daesh with a combination of small arms, heavy machine guns, mortars and rocket-propelled grenades. On this day, the Iraqi security forces identified 3 enemy personnel in a building and 4 enemy personnel in a courtyard adjacent to that building, armed with heavy weapons. It was assessed that the enemy was establishing a defensive firing position in the building and the courtyard ahead of the Iraqi advance. There had been previous engagements in this area, and the Iraqi forces were nearby, and in fact the closest being 70 metres away. Following an Iraqi request for Coalition air support and an assessment of the legality of the requested airstrikes, Coalition aircraft, including 2 Australian A-18F Super Hornets, struck a number of targets. The Australian aircraft released 1 weapon each, striking a building and a courtyard identified as the enemy positions. Post-strike assessments confirmed the 500-pound precision-guided munition struck the intended targets and achieved the effect that was desired by the Iraqi ground commander. Based on the proximity of the enemy to the Iraqi forces, the nature of the target and the circumstances of the fighting in Mosul at the time, I can confirm that this action complied with Australia's rules of engagement and the laws of armed conflict. Australia was first advised by our Coalition partners in January 2018 that one of these Australian strikes, the strike against the building, and nearby Coalition strikes potentially caused civilian casualties. The civilian casualties were claimed via local media and social media to have been located in a building in the vicinity of the Australian and coalition strikes. And following an investigation that concluded in December of 2018, the coalition assessed the claim to be credible. They are expected to announce that finding in the coming day. Our own investigation concurs it is possible the coalition unintentionally caused these casualties. While the allegation has been assessed as credible, there is a degree of uncertainty surrounding this incident. We know that the Australian strike does not precisely correspond with the information provided in the claim. However, it was close by. We do not definitively know how these people were killed. But we do know from our review of the events that our aircrew made no error in this mission. They delivered their ordnance precisely onto the designated target in accordance with their rules of engagement. All authorities for the strike were valid and lawful. There was no specific intelligence to indicate civilians were present at the targeted site, but given the urgent circumstances facing the Iraqi forces at the time, it was impossible to be certain. Throughout the Mosul campaign, Daesh deliberately and deceptively caused civilian casualties by concealing non-combatants, underfighting positions and exposing their fighters to induce coalition airstrikes. Any loss of civilian life is highly regrettable. We treat all allegations seriously and publicly account for them. Now, I can say from personal experience that the responsibility to take lethal action in wartime is a heavy burden to carry. Our pilots and decision makers involved in the targeting process do everything that they can to avoid civilian casualties, but sometimes it is not possible. This is an extraordinary thing to ask of our young women and men, the gravity of which is not lost on any of us. So before I take your questions, can I please remind you that this information is embargoed until the release of the Coalition statement, which we expect later tonight or tomorrow, Australian time. The uncertainty as to when that will be released will be defined to you with the release and issue of our own media statement. If I could offer for questions.
Sorry, so you won't be able to tell us in advance about when that's going to be released?
All I can, and truthfully it's the knowledge that I have, they make the announcement each month on the last Thursday of the month, or the release of the civilian casualty report. The timing of that depends on during the day, whatever time they choose to release the information.
So will that go up on that coalition website, is that right?
I'll check with my experts on that. I believe it does go up on the coalition website. We can get you the source for that and appropriate links if necessary, so you can go to that site.
What access have the investigations by the Australian and coalition investigations had to the actual ground site in Mosul where the deaths are supposed to have taken place?
No access. So, and I highlight that the incident on the 13th of June, of course we carry out appropriate post-strike review to make as best an assessment both of the success of the military objective, but also to see if we can gain any information about civilian property damage and indeed civilian casualties. There was no apparent elements to that in the initial assessments, but then given we weren't aware of the allegation that came through Air Wars, through their website, until January of 2018. So at the time of the strikes, as I said, it was an intense and complex war zone, not available for us to go in and see the site deliberately. And then 7 months later, the state of the site has changed significantly, and so we rely on information through the coalition, through our partner forces, and our own access to videos and other imagery that we have to do the investigation.
So is the suggestion that the civilians were in a neighbouring building, or is that in terms of when you say there's some uncertainty, our aircraft delivered the munitions precisely, but is that what the suggestion is? That yeah.
That's correct. So the Iraqi security forces, as they conducted their action to defeat Daesh and liberate West Mosul, came across these enemy personnel in the positions that I've described. The targets that were then engaged by the coalition aircraft, including the Australian aircraft, and I emphasise again, those weapons were delivered accurately to those targets, were in close proximity to the way the social media sites and the Air Wars website reported where the civilian casualties occurred. So the building that was highlighted there wasn't quite the same building as those points that were targeted, but the proximity was close enough that we can't discount that the impact and effect of those strikes may well have resulted. It's a credible assessment that may well have resulted in civilian casualties in that area.
Is there any information as to how many coalition aircraft were involved in this raid? You know, was the Australian aircraft 2 of 3 or 2 of 6? And is there any information as to the civilians? Were they a sole family, an extended family, simply refugees fleeing? What do we know about them?
So, first question regarding numbers of aircraft. So I will comment on the Australian contribution, and that was two F-18F Super Hornets, one of which dropped a single GPS-guided 500-pound explosive weapon that was deemed to have impacted a target that was in proximity to the presence of civilians, or could have been in proximity to civilians that may have caused a civilian casualty. In terms of the civilian casualties themselves, the only information that we have available is the information that was on the Air Wars website that refers to 4 people by name, and then there's an association and discussion on the website that reports the potential involvement of their family members as well.
Did other aircraft drop bombs in the same area?
Yes, there were other
action taking place at the same time?
That's correct. There were other coalition aircraft involved that did deliver weapons, and it's a small, built-up but busy urban block where these buildings were targeted. There are a number that were destroyed, but there's a number that still remain standing.
So more than one bomb hit the same site?
Generally, one bomb was applied to each of the targets. I don't have the information as to whether there were multiple weapons, but they were all guided to their specific targets, whether it was 1 or 2. I don't have that information about the coalition aircraft. I do have it about the Australian strikes.
And there were 2 Australian bombs dropped.
That's correct.
1 from each aircraft. Can you tell us, were those weapons or the guidance system used to direct those weapons? Because there are a couple that operate on these weapons.
That's correct.
What guidance system was directing the 2 Australian weapons?
So they were GPS-guided weapons. It's called a GBU-38, a 500-pound class high-explosive weapon that uses GPS signals. You enter the coordinates, very accurate GPS coordinates into the weapon, and then it guides you using the GPS signal.
Is it fair to say that had you known the proximity of the civilians at the time that the weapons were fired, they wouldn't have been fired?
That's
right?
correct.
So where is the failure in the system? Clearly you don't believe it's with the pilot. Where is the failure in the system that allowed this to happen?
So the Iraqi security forces are the forces that requested the strike. So they assess the environment they're in as much as possible. We would have as much surveillance as we can of the area to understand what we would call the pattern of life. In this particular situation, this was a defensive response, so the opportunity to do that surveillance in more detail was not available due to the direct threat to serious injury and imminent loss of life to the Iraqi security forces in the mission that they were engaged with. So we take action to examine in the legal assessment prior to the authority being provided to release those weapons. And that's an authority provided to the pilots for them to then release. We make an assessment on the balance of what we can see as to whether we think there might be civilians there or not.
So was it the case that if the airstrike hadn't been launched, the Iraqi security forces would have been killed themselves by the enemy? It was.
That's correct, and indeed, as I've said, I'm not certain that it was the result of Australian strike or coalition airstrike or ground fire from the Iraqi security forces in aiming to take the objective, or indeed action by other actors, and by that I also mean Daesh themselves. We just are not certain what may have resolved in the loss of life in this case that's resulted in the report on the Air Wars website.
So it's GPS guided bomb, so you know exactly where, you have the coordinates of exactly where it fell?
We do, and the aircrew with the targeting systems they use, they can observe where the impact was.
The second crew was observing this as well. So
well,
where were the casualties?
I wouldn't assume that. The second crew may have incidental video and footage of what the other their wingman's bomb where it impacted, but the other crew are predominantly focusing on delivering their weapon accurately.
How far from the drop site were the casualties?
Oh my goodness! It's within half of a normal urban block.
So I'm just thinking, what's the radius of destruction of a 500-pound bomb, and does that fall within that range?
It may do. So I won't give you the details on the actual distance, but you could talk in the order of 100 or so metres. And a key point for us is the weapons, high explosive weapons, they're designed to cause damage and indeed death to adversaries. But we can manage how we deliver that weapon, for example, by adjusting the fusing setting on the weapon. We can have it impact or explode as soon as it hits the ground. We can, in some cases, we could have it explode above the ground. And in cases of buildings, for example, to destroy a building, we would delay the fusing to make sure the bomb explodes within the building. And the reason I raise this is that then contains the damage to that building, and it allows us to be very precise in our assessment of damage and indeed trying to minimise collateral damage to other areas. And that's, in this case, two different fusing settings, and I won't go into which ones were used where, but two different fusing settings to achieve the effects that we were asked to achieve by the Iraqi security forces. The aircrew made the correct selections of those settings to deliver what the Iraqi security forces needed to neutralise the threat at the time, and in also minimising any collateral damage as a result of their strikes.
To be clear though, is it your belief that the urgency of protecting the Iraqi forces on the ground compromised the business of determining whether civilians were nearby?
It's certainly the priority for defence, collective defence of the Iraqi security forces, has to be taken into account in proportion to the risk of collateral damage. And we take all feasible precautions to minimise civilian casualties.
And that was at play in this case?
Absolutely. And legally assessed before the authority for strike was provided. So the business
of determining whether civilians were there was compromised by that urgency?
No, I wouldn't say it's compromised. The assessment was that there were the likelihood of civilian casualties or civilians present there was low, but there's always the likelihood. Sorry, can I just go over here first?
You made a particular point, I think 3 or 4 times now, talking about that legal authorisation. Can I just clarify, is that a normal part of the assessment of any airstrike that the Australians may be involved in, or are you implying that there was a particular challenge to this request made by Australians involved in authorising that?
That is a normal process. It's our obligation under our, first of all, the laws of armed conflict, which are internationally recognised and set, and secondly, under the rules of engagement that our government authorises us to operate under. The there is a very deliberate chain to go back through the command and control centre to an Australian authority who has the authority from the Australian government in accordance with our rules of engagement to authorise a strike that takes into account those civilian risks.
You've been very clear to apportion responsibility to the Iraqi ground forces for their scoping of the scene, and in essence saying that you can't blame the executioner for what was carried out here. Has anyone been reprimanded on the ground for this action? Is that process going to take place, or is this merely, for lack of a better way of describing, part of the process of war and sometimes things happen?
So I'd change the word slightly there. We're not blaming the Iraqi security forces for this event or this incident. We're very cognizant of the risk of inflicting civilian casualties in a very intense, complex war zone. The action in Mosul was the most ferocious air campaign that we have seen in our generation. It is an unfortunate consequence of war that these civilian casualties have occurred. And as I've said, this is not lost on us.
Could I check on the timing? Just before you said that the Air Wars had done a report on this. So how long after the incident had Air Wars published that report? And then when was Defence aware that, first became aware that Australian forces could be involved in it? It seems to me you're saying that you became involved from the coalition report. And then when did the Australian investigation start?
So as I've said, I can't really add anything else to that. We were first aware of the allegation of civilian casualties in January of 2018, and the incident occurred on the 3rd of June. If I can just provide a little bit of context here. And I think the figures, and I think you'll probably see this in the Coalition Civilian Casualty Report. Over the period of the campaign to defeat Daesh, up to that point, in excess of 33,000 strikes that have occurred. The numbers, and they'll report this in the Coalition summary this evening, I feel certain, in the order of, or more than, slightly more than 1,000 civilian casualties. But within that, the impact on Daesh and the enemy forces, the ability to liberate in the order of 8 million Iraqis back to their sovereign state. These are the sort of statistics that we have to have a think about in the very grim business of a country, the government of Iraq, fighting for the sovereignty of their country.
So when you found out about it, Defence found out about it in January 2018?
Yes.
So that's 6 months after the strike or something like that?
7 months, yeah.
So that was from the Coalition or from the Air Wars?
That's from Coalition, but I think they gathered their information coming out of the Air Wars website.
Okay, so why wouldn't we monitor the Air Wars website, and considering that they had some idea of the location of the strike?
The global coalition for the defeat of Daesh, that we have to have some semblance of coherency and approach to that. We still monitor all these things, but we take our lead from the coalition, and that's through Operation Inherent Resolve.
How many more inquiries?
Sorry, can I just go up to the end here, Judith?
Thanks. I wanted to ask if there's any move to provide compensation to surviving family members, given you've got names and the claims assessors credible?
So, as I've just explained, the global coalition for the defeat of Daesh is commanded and led through the Operation Inherent Resolve. Claims for compensation are dealt with through that organisation. I do note that Australia has committed funds to the reconstruction and humanitarian assistance to Iraq. Our government has provided, I think it's in the order of $100 million, and there's a period of that over a 3-year period. But we don't take deliberate or direct action from an Australian government perspective for the compensation element. That's managed through Operation Inherent Resolve.
How many more inquiries are underway at the moment, if any, that we might be hearing about down the track?
Yeah, so, oh my goodness, I'd have to get that information for you. And it will be apparent in the, sorry Chris, if you can just bear for a moment. It will be apparent in the Coalition report. They will have a long list, and I won't quote the number because I'd hate to get it wrong for you, but there's a considerable number of strike and events that the Operation Inherent Resolve are continuing to investigate.
Including Australian involved?
It may include Australian strikes that have occurred. That new information comes to light, then we will investigate fully any further allegations of this nature.
I'll just ask one last broad question on this. So you're talking about urban warfare where you can't by its nature know who's in every building against an opponent that does not recognise any rules of war, in fact flaunts them. You're putting troops in harm's way and you have a choice of whether or not you should defend them. You have a population in Australia who won't accept any civilian casualties. Is it getting more and more impossible for the Australian Army, Navy and Air Force to fight wars?
I think that challenge has always been in place. The visibility of what we do and the difficult task that we're given becomes very apparent to the Australian public. That is a matter for government in their decisions to commit Australian military capability to pursue violence if necessary in pursuit of Australia's national interests. That remains a challenge for us. All I can really add is that we are highly trained. We have great equipment that allows us to be as accurate, as disciplined, in accordance with international rules and the rules of engagement that our government sets. And the people on the ground, in the air, on board our vessels are always called upon to make very difficult decisions, and they do that on behalf of the public. And some of those decisions result in actions that can be regrettable, but in either way, the horror of war is certainly not an easy thing to deal with.
Can I just ask quickly, will these two pilots go on to be decorated for their service?
No, that will be determined through our normal processes. Certainly.
It won't stand in the way.
No, absolutely, and I emphasise that the aircrews and those in the authority chain performed in accordance with rules of engagement. And that's, rest assured, all that's been deeply investigated to, coming back to your original question there, Tim, to ensure that we learn as many lessons as possible to to take all feasible action to ensure that we minimise civilian casualties. This is no kidding the last question, Tim.
Air Wars has long historically had far higher casualty numbers than coalition estimates. Do you now consider Air Wars a credible source, and particularly in terms of those estimates?
Yeah, I don't judge Air Wars in that regard. I note their assessments, and in this case, as an example, their allegation began with a number of about 50. It then came back to about 34, and then it talked about people being pulled alive from rubble. So we just have to be careful in taking context their assessments. I'm not saying they're right or wrong, but what I am saying is that the inquiries that we conduct, the investigations that we conduct, apply to the best level of our knowledge, the basis of information that indicates to us what civilian populations may be, and that's why we deem in this case that the allegation is credible, but we will never truly know how many people, nor indeed how they were killed. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.